I was just a shadow in his penthouse, a maid who saw the blood he couldn't wash away. But when the most feared mafia boss in Seoul looked into my eyes, he didn't kill me, he made me his secret. Now, I'm holding the one document that could destroy his empire, but it's the same one that proves he's the reason my father is dead. Would you stay for love, or burn it all for revenge? This is the Dragon's Shadow on Afro K Chronicles. Amari stood in the center of the penthouse suite on the 50th floor of the Golden Aegis, her reflection ghosting against the floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the neon veins of Seoul. To the world, she was a shadow, a girl born of Ghanaian heritage and raised in the quiet corners of Korea, possessing a name that meant great strength, but living a life that felt like a slow fade into nothingness. She adjusted the collar of her gray cleaning uniform, her dark skin a stark and beautiful contrast against the sterile white marble of the most expensive room in Asia. She was 22 years old and carrying a debt of 50 million won left behind by a father who died chasing a dream that didn't belong to him. Every sweep of her mop was a rhythmic countdown to freedom, a silent prayer that the universe would continue to overlook her. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had learned that visibility was a trap. In a city that prided itself on perfection, Amari was the flaw they tried to ignore, and she used that. She heard the secrets whispered in elevators and saw the envelopes exchanged in dark corners, but she remained a ghost. That was her armor until the heavy oak doors of the suite swung open and the air in the room died. Kong Dae entered like a storm wrapped in a $3,000 silk suit. He was the heir to the Blue Dragon Syndicate, a man whose name was whispered with a mix of reverence and terror from the docks of Incheon to the boardrooms of Gangnam. He was 28, possessed of a jawline that could cut glass and eyes that held the cold, unyielding depth of the deep sea. He didn't look at Amari because Kang Dae didn't look at furniture. He walked to the center of the room, followed by two men whose shadows seemed to bleed into the carpet. Amari froze in the corner, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she didn't drop her gaze. She watched as one of the men fell to his knees, pleading in a voice that cracked like dry earth. Kang Dae didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply leaned down, his movements fluid and lethal, and whispered something that made the kneeling man turn ash gray. Subscribe to Afro K Chronicles for more stories of forbidden love and dangerous secrets. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the muffled sound of a suppressed thump. Amari's breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary sound that sliced through the quiet. Kang Dae froze. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on the girl in the gray uniform. For 3 seconds, time ceased to exist. He expected her to scream, to faint, or to beg. Instead, Amari stood her ground, her chin tilted up, her amber eyes meeting his obsidian ones with a defiance that felt like a physical strike. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum in the very marrow of her bones. Amari didn't blink. "I am the person who is going to finish cleaning this floor so I can go home," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline roaring through her veins. Kang Dae took a step toward her, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain clinging to him. He reached out, his gloved fingers stopping just inches from her throat. "You saw what happened," he noted, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of the fear he fed on. "I see many things, Kang Dae," she said, using his name without the honorifics that usually guarded his ego, "but I have a very short memory for things that don't belong to me." A smirk, thin and dangerous, ghosted across his lips. He realized in that moment that she was the perfect weapon. A woman the world refused to see was the only one he could trust with the things he needed to hide. He didn't kill her. Instead, he reached into his pocket and tossed a heavy gold coin onto the marble. "You work for me now," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Not the hotel, not the city, but me." The weeks that followed were a blur of high stakes and quiet moments. Kang Dae moved Amari from the cleaning staff to his personal quarters, calling her his executive assistant, though the syndicate knew her only as the Shadow. He was a man plagued by a mind that never turned off, an insomniac who paced the halls of his empire while the rest of Seoul slept. He was surrounded by thousands of people, yet he was utterly alone, until he found her sitting in his kitchen at 3 in the morning. If you are enjoying this journey into the shadows, make sure to hit that subscribe button for Afro K-Chronicles. Amari didn't ask him about the blood on his cuffs or the names on his hit list. Instead, she moved to the stove and began to brew a tea her grandmother had taught her back in Accra, a blend of roots and spices that smelled of earth and peace. "Drink this," she commanded, pushing the porcelain cup toward him. Kang Dae looked at the tea, then at the woman whose presence was beginning to feel like the only real thing in his manufactured life. He drank, and for the first time in 10 years, the voices of the men he had stepped over to reach the top went silent. He fell asleep at the table, his head resting near her hand, and Amari found herself tracing the line of his shoulder, wondering when the man who terrified the world had become the only person who made her feel seen. The romantic tension between them was a wire stretched to the breaking point. It was in the way his hand lingered on the small of her back as he guided her through a crowd of rivals, or the way she would adjust his tie, her fingers brushing the skin of his neck, sending a jolt of electricity through both of them that felt more dangerous than any bullet. He began to buy her silk dresses in the color of the midnight sky, wanting to see her wrapped in the luxury she deserved, but she kept them in the closet, preferring the simplicity of her own clothes. "You can't buy my loyalty, Kang Dae," she told him one evening as they stood on the balcony of his mountain villa. "I already have your loyalty," he whispered, stepping into her space until their breaths mingled in the cold air. "I want the parts of you that you don't show the world." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb grazing the fullness of her lower lip. The power dynamic was shifting. He was the boss of the city, but in this small, quiet space, she was the one with the power to destroy him. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, a silent admission of a hunger that had nothing to do with business. Amari felt the butterflies in her stomach turn into a roar of wings. She wanted to lose herself in him, to forget the blood and the debt, but the ghosts of their pasts were never far away. Don't miss the conclusion of this epic romance. Subscribe to Afro K-Chronicles and turn on notifications. The midpoint of their piece came on a Tuesday, a day that started with sunlight and ended in a storm. Kang Dae was away at a meeting in Busan, leaving Amari alone in the penthouse. While organizing his private safe, a task he had trusted only to her, a single file fell from the shelf. It was a dusty, yellowed folder from 12 years ago, marked with her father's name. Amari's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were photos of her father, a younger version of the man she loved, and a series of bank transfers. Her breath stopped as she read the final document. It wasn't a loan shark who had trapped her father in debt. It was the Blue Dragon Syndicate. Kang Dae's father had orchestrated the ruin of her family to seize the land they owned, and the final signature authorizing the collection of the debt, the signature that had indirectly led to her father's heart failure from the stress, was a young, cold Kang Dae. The man she was falling for wasn't her savior. He was the architect of her misery, and every touch, every silk dress, and every whispered word had been built on the ashes of her father's life. She stood in the center of the room, the ledger clutched to her chest, as the door opened and Kang Dae walked in, a smile on his face that died the moment he saw the papers in her hand. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary. It was the suffocating stillness of a tomb, and Amari felt the papers in her hand vibrate with the force of her trembling. Kang Dae stood by the door, his hand still resting on the handle, his dark eyes moving from the open safe to the tear-stained face of the woman he had begun to call his own. The golden light of the setting sun sliced across the floor like a blade, separating them by a sea of marble that felt miles wide. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said, his voice stripped of its usual warmth, sounding once again like the cold prince of the underworld. Amari let out a laugh that sounded like glass breaking, her eyes flashing with a fire that burned through her tears. "You mean I wasn't supposed to know that the man who held me while I cried about my father's death was the same man who signed his death warrant?" She spat, the words leaving her mouth like venom. She held up the ledger, the ink of his signature from 12 years ago, looking like dried blood on the page. "You were 19 years old, Kang Dae. You knew exactly what you were doing when you authorized the seizure of his life," she said, her voice rising in a crescendo of grief. Kang Dae took a step forward, his hand reaching out instinctively, but she recoiled as if his touch were a brand. "Don't," she warned, the words sharp and final. He stopped, his jaw tightening, his obsidian eyes reflecting a depth of regret he had never allowed himself to feel until this moment. "My father built this empire on the bones of men like yours, Amari, and back then, I was just a shadow of his will. I did what was expected of an heir," he explained, but the excuse fell flat in the face of her agony. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "that you were just a loyal dog to a monster while my father lost everything including his will to live?" She didn't wait for an answer. She shoved the folder into her bag and moved toward the door, her heart a shattered mess in her chest. "If you were in Amari's shoes, would you stay to hear him out or walk away forever? Tell me in the comments." The emotional fallout was a storm that leveled everything in its path. Amari didn't go back to her small apartment. She knew his men would be there within the hour. Instead, she vanished into the crowded streets of Itaewon, using the very invisibility she had once hated to hide from the most powerful man in Seoul. She stayed in cheap motels where the walls smelled of old cigarettes and the neon signs flickered like her fading hope. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the phantom touch of his hand on her cheek, a memory that now felt like a betrayal of her own blood. She was alone again, but this time, the loneliness was a choice. She looked at the ledger, the evidence that could dismantle the Blue Dragon Syndicate if it reached the right hands, and realized she held the power to destroy the only man who had ever truly seen her. Back in the penthouse, the world was falling apart. Kang Dae sat in the dark, the tea she had made for him days ago sitting cold and forgotten on the table. His insomnia returned with a vengeance, but it wasn't just the voices of his rivals keeping him awake, it was the ghost of her amber eyes. His underboss, a man with a scarred face and a heart of stone, stood in the shadows. "We found her location. Boss, should we retrieve the ledger?" he asked. Kang Dae didn't look up. "No," he said, his voice a hollow echo of its former power. "But the evidence she is could send us all to prison for life," the underboss argued. "Let her keep it," Kang Dae replied, his gaze fixed on the empty space where she used to stand. "If my ruin is what she needs to find peace, then let the empire burn." The separation stretched into 2 long, agonizing weeks. Amari spent her days watching the news, expecting to see her father's story finally told, but she couldn't bring herself to hand over the papers. She was caught in a push and pull of the soul, a war between the daughter who wanted justice and the woman who still loved a monster. She found herself standing outside the Golden Aegis at midnight, looking up at the 50th floor, wondering if he was looking out the window too. She realized then that revenge wouldn't bring her father back, and it wouldn't fix the hole in her heart that Kang Dae had filled and then emptied. Do you think a person can truly change if they were raised in a world of violence? Let me know your thoughts. The redemption arc began in the most unlikely of places. Kang Dae didn't send his hitmen or his lawyers. Instead, he sent a single, handwritten note to the motel where she was hiding. It didn't contain threats or pleas, it only contained an address and a time. When Amari arrived at the quiet cemetery on the outskirts of the city, she found Kang Dae standing before her father's grave. He wasn't wearing his $3,000 suit. He was in a simple black coat, looking older and more tired than she had ever seen him. He had spent the last 14 days doing something no boss of the Blue Dragon had ever done. He had been liquidating the assets his father had stolen. "I can't change the past, Amari," he said as she approached, the wind whipping her hair across her face. He handed her a new set of documents, genuine ones this time. "I have returned every one of the debt, and the land your father loved has been placed in your name," he told her. "It's not enough, but it's the only way I know how to start." He stood there, vulnerable and exposed, in a place where any of his enemies could have taken his head. He was offering her his life, not through a contract, but through a sacrifice. "I've stepped down," he whispered. "The syndicate is being dismantled. I'm no longer the prince of anything." Amari looked at the documents, then at the man who had given up an empire for a chance at her forgiveness. The power dynamics had shifted completely. He was no longer the captor, and she was no longer the shadow. She saw the emotional wounds in his eyes, the deep-seated pain of a man who had finally woken up to the horror of his own legacy. She realized that his obsession with her hadn't been about possession, it had been about a desperate need to be saved from himself. Would you be able to forgive someone who was part of your family's ruin if they gave up everything to make it right? She took a step toward him, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the cold marble of her father's headstone. "I hated you for 15 days, Kang-dae," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And I'll probably hate parts of you for the rest of my life." She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his for a sign of the coldness that used to live there. "But I can't breathe without you, and I think my father would have wanted me to live for the future, not die for the past." Kang-dae didn't move, afraid that if he did, she would vanish like a dream. He stood still as she closed the distance between them, her presence acting like a balm to his fractured soul. He felt the butterflies return, not the frantic ones born of fear, but the slow, rhythmic ones born of a love that had survived a fire. He reached out, his fingers brushing her dark skin with a reverence that felt like a prayer. "You don't have to be a shadow anymore," he told her, the obsidian of his eyes finally reflecting the light of a new day. "I don't want to be a shadow," she replied, a small, tired smile tugging at her lips. "I want to be the woman who reminds you every day that you're a better man than your father." As the sun began to rise over the hills of Seoul, the two of them stood among the silent stones, two broken people trying to put the pieces back together. The debt was paid, the empire was falling, and the secrets were finally out in the open. The stakes were no longer about money or power, they were about the quiet, terrifying courage it takes to love someone in spite of who they used to be. They walked out of the cemetery together, the daughter of the man who lost everything and the son of the man who took it, leaving the shadows behind and stepping into a world where their names were the only things that belonged to them. The weight of the ledger in her bag felt lighter now, no longer a weapon, but a reminder of the truth they had survived. Kang-dae gripped her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, a silent promise that he would never let her fade away again. They were heading into an uncertain future, but for the first time in either of their lives, they weren't walking alone. The blue dragon was dead, but in its place, a man and a woman were learning how to breathe. The wind at the cemetery began to howl, kicking up the fallen leaves around their feet as if the earth itself knew that the peace they had found was only a temporary truce with destiny. Kang-dae pulled Amari closer, his coat shielding her from the chill, but his eyes were no longer on the gravestones. They were fixed on the black sedans that had crested the hill like a row of silent predators. The redemption he had sought was real, but in the world of the Blue Dragon, you don't just walk away from a throne without leaving a trail of blood behind you. "I thought you said the syndicate was being dismantled," Amari whispered, her hand tightening on his arm as the car doors opened in perfect synchronization. "I did," Kang-dae replied, his voice regaining that steel edge that sent shivers down her spine. "But my father's old guard doesn't want to be retired. They want a king who stays on his knees." The climax of their journey didn't happen in a dark alley. It happened under the blinding lights of the very docks where the Blue Dragon had made its billions. Lee Jin-ho, the rival who had spent years waiting for Kang-dae to show a single crack in his armor, stood by the edge of the dark water, holding a detonator that looked like a toy in his massive hand. He had seized the final shipment of the syndicate's assets, the money Kang Dae intended to use to fund his new life with Amari, and he had taken the one-person Kang Dae's younger brother, the only family he had left, as bait. Kang Dae moved forward, his steps echoing on the cold concrete, while Amari watched from the shadows of a shipping container, her heart a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. If you were Kang Dae, would you risk everything to save a brother who might have betrayed you? Let me know in the comments below. The air was thick with the scent of salt and diesel fuel, a heavy atmosphere that made every breath feel like a struggle. Lee Jin-ho laughed, a sound that was devoid of any humor. You gave it all up for a shadow, Kang Dae, he mocked, gesturing toward the empty space where Amari was hiding. You destroyed a legacy for a girl who cleans floors. Kang Dae didn't flinch, he didn't even look at the guns pointed at his chest. I didn't destroy a legacy, I stopped a plague, he said, his voice carrying over the sound of the crashing waves. He took a final step, putting himself directly in the line of fire. Take the money, take the docks, take the name, he commanded, but let the boy go. Amari knew she couldn't just stand there and watch the man she loved be executed for the crime of wanting a better life. She remembered the layout of the docks from the ledgers she had studied. She knew the emergency release valves for the pressurized steam pipes were located just 10 feet from where the gunman stood. She moved through the darkness, her small frame making her nearly invisible against the stacks of iron and steel. She was no longer a victim of her past. She was the architect of her own future. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she yanked the heavy iron lever. The world exploded in a hiss of white steam and screaming metal. The sudden roar of the pipes blinded the gunman, creating a chaotic fog that swallowed the pier. Kang Dae didn't waste a second. He moved like a shadow himself, disarming the nearest guard and tackling his brother to the safety of the ground. In the whiteout of the steam, he found Amari's hand, his fingers locking onto hers with a grip that promised he would never let go. They ran through the labyrinth of the docks, the sounds of gunfire echoing behind them, but the bullets were hitting air. They reached the end of the pier where a small, unassuming boat was waiting, its engine humming a low song of escape. Do you think Amari's courage was the final piece Kang Dae needed to see she was his equal? Tell me your thoughts. The final confrontation wasn't about who had the most guns, it was about who was willing to leave it all behind. As they pulled away from the dock, the lights of Seoul shrinking into the distance, Kang Dae watched as the warehouse containing the Blue Dragon's last records went up in a ball of orange flame. Lee Jin-ho had tried to take everything, but he had only succeeded in burning the bridge that kept Kang Dae tied to his past. The ledger Amari had carried was now just ash in the wind, and the debt that had started their story was finally settled in full. The resolution began as the sun touched the horizon of the East Sea. They didn't go to a palace or a penthouse, they arrived at a small, weathered house on the cliffs of Jeju Island, a place where the air smelled of oranges and the only sound was the rhythm of the tide. Kang Dae stood on the porch, his hands shoved into his pockets, looking out at the water. For the first time in 28 years, his eyes were clear, the shadows of his father's sins finally washed away by the sea. Amari stepped out behind him, wrapped in a simple wool sweater, her rare English name sounding like music as he whispered it into the morning air. Are you okay? She asked, her hand resting on the small of his back. He turned to her, and the smile he gave her was one she had never seen before. It was a smile of a man who was truly free. I'm better than okay, he said, pulling her into a gentle embrace that held no fear, no power play, and no secrets. He leaned his forehead against hers, the two of them a perfect silhouette against the rising sun. They had lost an empire, they had faced a war, and they had survived the truth. They were no longer the boss and the maid, they were just Kang Dae and Amari, two souls who had found home in the middle of a storm. What is the one thing you would never forgive in a partner, even if they tried to change? I want to hear your stories. The final scene of their story wasn't a wedding with thousands of guests or a display of wealth. It was a quiet dinner in their small kitchen. Amari brewed the tea that had once saved his mind, and Kangdae sat across from her, his hands steady and his heart at peace. The blue dragon was a ghost of the past, and the future was a blank page they were going to write together. As the stars began to poke through the velvet sky of Jeju, the shadow wife and the dragon prince blew out the candle, finally stepping out of the dark and into a life that belonged only to them. This has been a journey through the heart of the underworld, brought to you by Afro Chronicles, where every shadow has a story and every heart has a choice. Kangdae reached across the table, his fingers tracing the line of her hand, a soft touch that sent a final wave of butterflies through her soul. "We made it," he whispered. "We did," she replied, her amber eyes reflecting the light of the moon. They were 1,000 miles away from the golden Aegis, but they had never been closer to heaven. The story of the shadow and the dragon ended not with a bang, but with the soft, steady sound of two people breathing in unison, finally safe, finally seen, and finally loved. Thank you for joining us on Afro Chronicles, and remember, even in the deepest darkness, love is the only light that can truly show you the way home.